two of the very best TFT players are disagreeing about one of the hardest patches ever in TFT. On the one hand, you have North America's greatest ladder player in Dishsoap, hyper consistent and some of the best stats you'll ever see on any profile. On the other hand, you have one of Korea's GOATs in Bobae. They both released their item tier list compositions about this patch. In this video, I break down both item tier lists and compare and contrast who puts things in the S tier and who's putting things on the bottom tier. Explain why they make their decisions, and ultimately come up with my own verdict. TFT is a game of opinions and ego, so I can't wait to see these two opinions clash and see what verdict we come to. Before we start, I think it's important to get context as to why the players ranked the items where they did, so that way we can figure out whether we agree or not. Let's kick it off with Dishsoap, who has blue buff, red buff, even shroud, and crown guard as his S tier. This is effectively his S, A, B, C, D tier. It's also nice because he defines why he thinks something is S versus A versus B versus C versus D, because the explanation is on the left. Red buff, I think most people can understand, is one of the strongest items in the game because it's the most versatile and powerful combat item you can make because it gives you attack speed, damage amplification, and anti-heal. It's kind of like an all-in-one shop. Attack speed is generically one of the best offensive stats you can ever get in the game because AD champions use it to scale their AD, whether they're attacking or casting a bunch of abilities. And then AP champions are able to actually scale really well because they cast much faster due to the attack speed because you get 10 mana per auto attack. So attack speed is really powerful, and this gives you so much of it while giving all that bonus damage. It's really huge. With now the improved blue buff, now you get more damage amp. And it's also really powerful on low mana champions like Ezreal, Ahri, Jhin, even Kiana, Akali, like all these different units can use it. And so now that it gives AD and AP and a bunch of mana and damage amp, it complements red buff extremely well in a lot of situations, especially for the users that like that kind of mana generation. Even Shadow is also a much preferred item than Last Whisper because you get to go 3 offensive items onto your carry and have the ability to get past the front line very quickly by shredding all their armor and bursting past. And the reason why he wants to slam Crown Guard really often, he puts it in S tier, is because he thinks it's the best use of Rod. Rod is considered to be the weakest item currently because there's just not a lot of champions that want all that AP. There's so many different traits in the game that give you plus ability power, things like KDA and Spellweaver, and he believes that Karthus and Twisted Fate are on the weak side, so it doesn't feel like you want to actually have ability power for those champions. And so the best use of that Rod is Crown Guard and actually scales pretty well on AP tanks. From there, he's willing to go into the A tier of really strong items that make sense as long as it doesn't mess up his item economy. Item economy is a really important concept to understand in TFT if you haven't heard of it. You talk about managing your gold, where you're trying to make interest thresholds and you try to get more gold so you can spend more gold and roll down and hit your board. Item economy is the same way, where you're only going to get a certain amount of items every single game no matter what. Somewhere between like 13 to 17 items on an average game depending on the portal. And then if you're able to live longer, you get more and more items. And there's also a couple of rules within the items itself, which is you can't get like all tiers and all swords and all belts. You have to get a distribution of items, and you only can get a certain amount of items every single stage. And so when you're talking about item economy, it's really important to think about what I can actually make now versus what is possible to drop later. And it's important to note that whatever you take on the carousel also doesn't affect your drop chances. So if you do end up taking, say, an extra sword on the carousel, that's not going to reduce the chance of getting a sword drop later. So when Dishsoap's talking about item economy, it's more about how you're managing all your components based off this knowledge. So if it doesn't mess up his item economy, very happy to slam things like Infinity Edge, Deathblade, Steadfast Heart, and Warmogs. And that's because these use a lot of double components like belt, sword, or things like extra vest or that glove. One thing to think about is how many components are being represented in this upper band tier. What I mean by that is just count the number of components that's being represented in the S and A tier. The one thing you can recognize is that there's a lot of belts, swords, and then tiers and bows because you want to duplicate them, and even some vests as well, which is going to go to show you that the weakest components that are not really represented here are Rod and Cloak. So that's the one way you can break down how Dishsoap is viewing things. If you get Rods and Cloaks, your chances are you're going to be struggling when you play the AD flex line. In the B tier, Dishsoap's putting a lot of items that he feels like are solid, but not exactly like items that he's trying to go out of his way to slam. And they all have an explanation. Anything with sword or tiers or bows, you'd rather just try to dedicate to items like red buff and blue buff and Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, Even Shroud. So for example, if you get dropped a bow, sword, and a tier, you'd rather try to see if you can greed for some of these components either through a portal, an augment, or maybe loose streak and get those best items. And then once you have things like a red buff and then you get another bow plus a sword, maybe that's when you slam things like Giant Slayer. And that pretty much applies to everything in this tier as well. And for what it's worth, if for people who are kind of new to tier lists, where they are in that tier, what ends up being slightly stronger. So red buff being at the very top, that means that he thinks red buff is the best within the top of the slams, and he thinks Infinity Edge is the best of the A tier, and so on and so forth. We have Giant Slayer, Hodge, Last Whisper. These are also like solid items situationally that can really make some AD champions and melee champions really good. Dragon's Claw is like a way for him to just kill cloaks, I think. It also applies to some of these defensive items like Bramble Vest and Stone Plate and Protector's Vow. Thieves Gloves is a good use of gloves that are left over, not to mention there's a lot of augments that synergize with it. Gunblade is probably the second best item in Dishsoap's mind to kill a rod with, so you can use a rod and a sword. The worst part is you have to use a sword, which you rather use for things like Deathblade and Infinity Edge. Guardbreaker, which uses a belt and a glove, so it's a little bit harder to justify compared to some of these other items. There's Gauge, which is an AD melee champion item. Runins, which is another AD item. Redemption, Adaptive, and Sunfire Cape, which can be used either on frontline or I guess in Adaptive Helm situationally on the backline. I mean, so as you can see, pretty much as I go through them, they all kind of have something that you'd rather prioritize above. So even though Status Gauge can be pretty impactful on some AD melee champions early, you'd rather have that sword in the belt to try to make that Warmogs and the Deathblade. Runins is the bow. It's the red buff, although I do think Runins is underrated. Also, particularly on units like Caitlyn, for example, or Ezreal, can really utilize it in a way that I think people aren't really thinking about. Redemption is a tier and a belt. My gosh, blue buff and Warmogs is really good. Adaptive Helm kills a cloak, which is kind of nice. Cloaks are a little bit on the underutilized side, but still, you'd rather have that tier for both of these components. And Sunfire Cape, again, you know, you're trying to go for red buff, which is an anti-heal item. You're not really trying to go out of your way of making a Sunfire Cape, and it doesn't even give you that many defensive stats because it's been nerfed over the course of sets now, and it's just not really that strong of an item compared to how it used to be, but still decent early if you just need anti-heal. If you're in a situation where, you know, say you do have like Even Shroud and IE, but, you know, you just make Sunfire Cape for your anti-heal, just slam it. Situational is like the C tier for Dishsoap, where he thinks like this item is either really good or probably just not useful at all. Morello is like the worst anti-heal item, mainly because there's not a lot of easy users of it. It's not many like widespread AP AoE champions. The most commonly used of it is Echo that takes Morello. So it's just kind of awkward, not to mention that you rather use the belts for, I guess, anything else above it, according to Dishsoap. I think this is actually the lowest placing belt item. So basically try to avoid Morello unless you absolutely need the anti-heal. There's some other users that can like situationally hold on to it, like maybe put on like a Viego because he casts in a giant AoE, or even a Yorick. I think Edge Knight is probably the most situational item in the game, where just if a unit is good with it, it is exceptional with it. In this current meta, it's a burst oriented meta, and so it's not even really about the cleanse of Edge of Night. It's really about the fact that it can just drop big amount of target damage, like if it already locks onto a Jax, or if you have like, you know, Caitlyn Ezreal locking onto your Zed. This Edge of Night item is what really unlocks a lot of power of those melee champions in particular. And so in some situations, fantastic. In others, it's just not really that great of an item. Bloodthirster, in the same way for that melee carries, it's very situational, and also just feels like it's inferior to a healing source of either Gunblade or Hand of Justice. One thing I actually didn't mention is that Sword is also combined with the Spatula for true damage emblem. So that's also another reason why you don't want to just throw away your swords nilly-willy. Nashor's Tooth being situational, I think Dishsoap considers Nashor's Tooth to be more of like a combo item that goes either with blue buff for like Ahri, or if you end up going Nashor's plus like an attack speed item or some kind of casting item, so that way you can amplify AP. But the big core issue is that it uses a bow and a belt. And if you use a bow and a belt that's not going towards things like red buff and frontline, and you're playing an AD flex line, Nashor's is very awkward because it gives you mainly AP and attack speed, which is adjacent to what we want. I will say that Nashor's is not that bad on Ezreal if you end up playing around him as an AD flex option, because he ends up having a low mana pool. So if you play blue buff Nashor's, that's actually something you can flex between Ezreal and Ahri, because those are two items that combo well off each other. And then Ahri, it's her best slot items, and Ezreal, it's playable, so it's something that you have as a flex option. And Quicksilver is like if you feel like your melee carry needs a lot of anti-CC. Right now in the metagame, pretty much the only champion that really wants it is Riven. I did a video covering Riven as a comp that's actually surging in popularity in China because her consistency and matchups in the meta, and she's probably the only champion that really wants it and is considered core. I don't even think the other champions really want Quicksilver nearly as much, like Yone, for example, or like a Jax. So I would consider Quicksilver to be even more situational. And then the very bottom, you can kind of see exactly where Dishsoap's head's at by the summary of this tier, which is these are EP/trap items. Anything that's like something that's exclusively used for AP or things that are bait goes into this tier for him. So Jewel Gauntlet, Deathcap, Archangels, I mean, these are all AP items, so he's not trying to play AP core comps. Spark and Shiv are shred items for magic resistance. He's just trying to deal a bunch of AD damage. Titan's Resolve, Rageblade, and Shojin, in his opinion, are trap items. Titan's Resolve is not a good item according to Dishsoap currently in the metagame because it's very burst oriented and it's not particularly really effective on even the melee champions that you theoretically want to benefit off of. The only champions that it could be good on would be Yone, because Yone is like a scaling champion that ramps up and he benefits from the ADAP pretty significantly, and probably Poppy because she uses every stat in the game. Not to mention that it's using bow and a vest, which could be repurposed for a lot of other items instead. And then Shojin Rageblade is an item combination that, while can be really powerful in the late game on certain champions like Sona, there's some things that's a really strong trap because Rageblade is an item that actually just falls off really hard outside of the early game, and it's just really not that effective on any late game champion outside of Sona. Fights are ending too quickly for you to ramp up, and you're also using a bow that can't be part of red buff. And then he puts Shojin as the very worst item in the game because it's tier and a sword, the two most premium offensive components in the game. And also Shojin doesn't feel like it's really strong on anyone for the same reason as Rageblade. It's not really best in slot on any specific carry. And so why do you even want to slam Shojin and ruin your item economy when you can have stronger items and stronger options in the late game? The only carry that he considers like Shojin to be good on might be like Twisted Fate, for example. And that's because he's a attack speed carry that scales off of the number of attacks. So Shojin can actually end up helping him cast more often. So the summary of the dish soap tier list to climb on this patch is bow good, tier good, sword good, belt good. Don't waste these items on pretty terrible things like Shojin Rageblade, Titan's Resolve. Don't get baited by AP, Rod bad, and try to slam these items first. And then whatever you have left over, just try to make some items that make sense for your composition. Like if you don't have anti-heal Sunfire, if you have frontline items, just slam them. And situationally make some of these items if you can. Bobae is a player who's hit rank 1 every set, just like Dish Soap. He's considered one of Korea's GOATs. He's been to the World Championship multiple times. I mean, just scroll through and you can look at some of his accomplishments where he's hit challenge every set and he's made it to the World Championships multiple times, finished rank 1 and rank 2 at the same time of North America and Korea. So it's safe to say that he knows a thing or two, not just about TFT, but also about like the Korean North American meta. So he's factoring a bunch of different things. Right off the bat, we can already see a big contrast to what Bobae thinks versus Dish Soap. Bobae puts Spear of Shojin as the #1 item in the game that he is going to prioritize. And that is in deep contrast to Dish Soap, who's putting it dead last, as in he thinks it is the biggest trap item. So why is that? Well, going through Bobae's video, he considers Spear of Shojin to be the ultimate flex item. In fact, during his video, Bobae even said, I don't even need to explain this. Spear of Shojin speaks for itself. It's like a good flex item. You can play it on AP, you can play it on AD. I mean, that was true a couple patches ago, back when Shojin was stronger before they nerfed it. But even still, Bobae believes that it's really powerful because it is solid early to try and get tempo and remain flexible across the AD and AP lines. And that's where he differs from Dish Soap, because Dish Soap is not trying to play AP at all. And Bobae is open to AP lines. I mean, just look, he's willing to even slam Jewel Gauntlet in the A tier as well. And this is a really big disagreement. And I think it's really fascinating that Bobae is willing to play AP. He's willing to play Twisted Fate. So we talked about how Twisted Fate is really good with Shojin. You can play that. You mentioned Karthus as an option. You can go for like Shojin and maybe Jewel Gauntlet on Karthus. He's willing to play Shojin on Ahri even though it's worse. He's willing to play Shojin on Caitlyn even though it's not Biss on her. And so for him, he feels like preserving that HP, getting that tempo lead early, playing for win streak when everyone else is trying to play lose streak is an opportunity for him to grab that advantage and preserve that HP to bleed out to really good top 4s and maybe even high roll for a first. Steadfast Hearts and Warmogs he believes are the best tank items in the game and are very similar. You really want to combo them with resistances in particular. And they also scale well off each other as well. You can go Steadfast Heart, Warmogs plus like a resistance item. Not much disagreement here with Dish Soap. They both value it really highly as well. Gunblade is another significant deviation from Dish Soap. Dish Soap puts Gunblade as like this, like whatever tier you can slam. Bobae believes Gunblade is very versatile and also a solid early game slam because it's something that you can kind of flex into. Not to mention that Gunblade is, in Bobae's opinion, the most crucial item for Ahri. He says that, you know, all these other items on Ahri, whether it's, you know, mana generation through blue buff or Nashers, you think that's interchangeable with things like red buff, rage blade, Shojin, whatever, because you can always find ways to generate mana. But Gunblade healing your front line is something that you can't replace. So Gunblade is not only like S tier on one of the best comps in the game with Ahri Sentinels, but also it's a flexible item because you could put it on other late game units like, you know, Jhin, for example, which overkills and heals a bunch of front line, or maybe even a Caitlyn. Hodge is also a versatile item and it combos really well with some crit items, which is kind of in tandem with Infinity Edge and Jewel Gauntlet. Another deviation from Dish Soap, who puts Hodge in the, you know, solid win streak leftover item tier, but nothing pretty crazy in that B tier. But IE blue buff, red buff is also an agreement, which is just really powerful offensive items. I think that this tier from Dish Soap is like S, and this is like S/A. So it might not even necessarily be correct to call this an A tier for Dish Soap, because I think he generally tries to go out of his way to slam these items if he can as well. So just from the very beginning at S tier, you can already see Bobae and Dish Soap, they think about items very differently. Although they do have a lot of similar core principles. Even Shroud and Crown Guard being here makes sense because, I think they kind of combo well with everything that they're saying, which is, Rod's generally a weak item. If you think about it, Gunblade and Crown Guard are actually just kind of 1-2 and 2-1 to some of these players, and Even Shroud is still really good for the AD shred. And that's actually similar to Last Whisper. I think Bobae said Even Shroud is the best version of armor reduction, but in the end, if you're playing a lot of AD in the meta, which he is, he's not trying to like play a ton of AP, it's just that he's open to it. Last Whisper is just as important if you can't get Even Shroud. And I like that he put it on the same tier here. Jewel Gauntlet's a really interesting item because he is willing to play the AP line, and also it's something that can be used early on some powerful AP champions that can burst. And it's also an important item on some executioners like Karthus because you want to get as much as you can to 100% crit, so that way you can just get that maximum amount of DPS. And so Jewel Gauntlet on Karthus is really powerful, and he is open to that. Also, another recommendation is if you have Jewel Gauntlet and you're playing around Ahri, I think a trap is to put it onto Ahri. You actually want to put it on someone adjacent to Ahri. Like if you play KDA, for example, Jewel Gauntlet is much better on Akali than it is Ahri, even though Akali primarily scares off of AD. This is because the AP ratios on Akali's ability is actually not that bad. So you'd rather put the JG on her plus the Executioner crit bonus. Now, this is another big deviation from Bobae and Dishsoap. Rageblade and Nashers in A tier. This is fascinating because these are primo items from the bows and the belts, and Dishsoap puts it at situational to trap / AP items. Bobae is a big believer in Rageblade in terms of being able to help scale your early game. It's a powerful tempo item, and he's also just so convinced that Sonar Rageblade is fundamentally broken if you're able to just get into a late game situation. So it's always like a late game out you can play towards. And then Nashers is a powerful combo item with those AP builds that he's kind of go for, because if he's willing to play like Shojin, then Shojin Nashers is a really strong tandem item. And so if you have Shojin, then you can think about Nashers to use that for a bow and a belt, and all of a sudden now you have some combo items in the late game that aren't nearly as bad. And he also calls out Ezreal as well as a good holder, so it's actually a very versatile item. And Thieves' Gloves is also just versatile. It's just a high roll item. It's a really powerful augment item that you can combine with things like Lucky Gloves and Sleight of Hand. So it's just really, really versatile in general, and that's where a lot of the power comes in. So if you step back and look at how Bobae views things, the more versatile and the more options he has in terms of playing compositions, the more open he can play, the more powerful and higher up on this tier that it is, on top of things that just have raw power, like, some of these defensive items or like red buff, blue buff. Fascinating. I'm actually really looking forward to the voting on this and seeing which I agree with based off the tally count. In B tier, Bobae puts Edge of Night as the center of gravity. If he puts something below Edge of Night, like Sunfire Cape Bramble, he thinks it's slightly below average to just well below average. And that's because he thinks that Edge of Night is either extremely good or extremely useless, so it averages out to kind of be in the middle. Redemption, Runins, and Bloodthirster are, he thinks, underrated items that people aren't slamming enough in certain situations. Specifically, Bloodthirster, he thinks that it's a more versatile item than Dishsoap. Dishsoap puts it as situational, and he puts it as like above average because he thinks Bloodthirster can be used on some tanks in the late game that people need for like extra shielding and HP. And then Sunfire, Bramble, and Deathblade. It's interesting that he puts Deathblade like a lot lower than Dishsoap because he thinks that the swords are too valuable. And compared to Dishsoap, he actually is willing to slam Shojin, so he kind of needs those extra components and not really willing to give up 2 swords for Deathblade. But he's willing to take free Deathblades for sure. He thinks that that's obviously really good. So item economy is a big reason why it's in the bottom of B, even though it's not a bad item whatsoever. Bramble is higher than Declaw. You might be thinking like, okay, we'll just put like Bramble, Declaw, Stoneplate, like Val, like all these defensive items, like all in the same tier, just like make whatever. Why is one significantly better than the other? This is because Bramble does a lot of effective work against AD, but Dragon's Claw is surprisingly kind of weak against AP because units like Ahri, they don't care about Dragon's Claw. They just completely shred and nuke the one champion anyways, and it doesn't feel like Dragon Claw effectively stops the AP champions from scaling anyways. Versus things like Bramble Vest, you stop melee champions and Caitlyn ults, and it actually can be very effective. Not to mention that it also has the adjacent benefit of having crits reduced, and that also applies to AP. So Bramble Vest is just a little bit more better than Dragon's Claw. Stoneplate is also like an okay but situational item. Like C tier is the situational slams here. Titan's Resolve is not a bait item for Bobae because I think he's willing to reroll a lot, and Titans is like good on some of these reroll compositions, but he actually changed his opinion on Titan's Resolve specifically because of Dishsoap. So funny enough, in the video for Bobae, he actually references Dishsoap, or should I call him DC Shop, and talked about how it actually convinced him to move Titan's Resolve down into the rankings. I think before that, a lot of people were rating him much higher. Dishsoap has another nickname also as the perfect player, or PP in TFT scene. So from the PP to the DC. Adaptive is versatile, but biggest problems that uses tiers, and he values tiers not just for blue buff, but also for Spear of Shojin. Same thing with Vow. Giant Slayer is not really important to late game, and swords are at a premium, so he just kind of puts it really low. Not to mention that a lot of champions are trying to target backline, like Caitlyn's trying to snipe backline. Ezreal goes through in a big AoE, so Giant Slayer's damage against backline units aren't even as effective. And then Gage is using a sword, basically, and he doesn't think it's very good on a lot of people that he's willing to play around. And even on the champions that really want it, you'd rather have some other things like Edge of Night for the swords. But interestingly enough, in the D tier, he kind of has the same opinion, which is just like all these AP items and Quicksilver are just way too situational and you don't really want to be slamming it. And just to hammer home, like, yes, he's willing to play some of these AP carries, but even so, he thinks that these items are bad slams and just not worth it. So even players who are open-minded to AP right now this patch think that this item tier is just dedicated for pretty much all the rod items. Two interesting deviations at the very end is that Guard Breaker is at D. He thinks Guard Breaker is like one of the worst items in the game, and Guard Breaker is like for Dish Soap a win streak or leftover item, and Dish Soap is putting it in like B tier. He feels like Guard Breaker is not only inconsistent, but the components are really valuable. Like the gloves could be used for so many different things, like Peace Gloves or Last Whisper, IE, and the belt is like a premium item. So that's one ding. And the second thing is that Guard Breaker is not really effective because, again, you're trying to like AoE wipe, and it's just not really what you're looking for right now in terms of your item economy. And then Morello is just like not really good in general. We talked about how it was barely situational on Dish Soap's tier list, and he thinks that there's no holders of it, and also that it's just bad and it's an AP item and you don't really want a lot of those AP items. So to summarize Bobae's tier list: flexibility in S and A tier, underrated decent combat items in B tier, situational things that might be good but it's like a lower priority and they're not even that important even in builds that might want it, and then D tier is like just stay away. So now we get to the part of the video where we get to decide and see who we agree with more. Is it Bobae or is it Dish Soap? So I put everything into a spreadsheet in terms of the biggest disagreements and the minor disagreements, and I'm going to tally up the votes and see who I agree with more. And maybe you guys will agree with me, or maybe you'll flame me in chat. Who knows? All right, so let's start things off with Spear of Shojin. Bobae puts it in S and Dish Soap puts it in D. The explanation is that Bobae is more flexible with items and he's willing to play around the AP lines sometimes, while Dish Soap wants to avoid it entirely. Part of the reason why Dish Soap puts it in D tier is because he thinks it's completely a bait, and if you are slamming it, you are just griefing yourself. He actually just made a rule for himself that he's not going to slam Shojin, and then he hit rank 1. And Bobae does slam Shojin, and he's also rank 1. So this is the explanation. My vote here goes to Bobae. I think Shojin is more versatile than Dish Soap is giving it credit for. I understand why he doesn't want to slam it, and it's really effective based on the 80 lines that he wants to flex into, particularly because he's also valuing other units like Akali a lot higher than other people. So I think that Bobae's explanation makes a lot more sense, and Shojin, while it's not the best in slot item on a bunch of champions, it's still pretty decent. If we're looking at the data of Shojin for Masters Plus, just on the surface level, right? This is just based off of the item stats at first glance. It's not that great on Ahri, but it's like playable. It's fantastic on Sona, but it's like kind of losing on Twisted Fate. You don't want a positive delta. That is the difference between having the item versus not. And it's like kind of okay on Karthus, but slightly losing. It's not great on Caitlyn, but it's good on Jhin, bad on Ezreal, like neutral on Senna if you reroll her. It's neutral on Annie. It's like pretty good on Ziggs. And so you kind of see how it's like playable on some units and not that good on others. I very much get where Dish Soap's coming from because it doesn't look particularly really impressive on any of these champions that are really popular with it. And if you sort by average placement or delta, which is pretty much the same thing, you're just getting a bunch of like low sample size things. Like if you have Shojin on Alawi, it's not that it's like the best item on Alawi, it's just that, you know, late game sometimes you don't have another holder of it. You're just putting items on your late game champions from carousels. Overall, I understand where Dish Soap's coming from data wise, but I really like the mentality that Bobae has because I think that ultimately leads to a more effective climb. If you're more flexible and open to different comps, you can capitalize on everyone playing the Caitlyn, Ahri's, Ezreal's, and contesting the same thing over and over, while you can get like a really easy Twisted Fate or a really easy maybe Karthus setup that he's describing and get that to a top 4. Hextech Gunblade being S is really interesting to me. The fact that Bobae's willing to slam it is also interesting. I actually am going to lean towards Dish Soap on this one because I think that Gunblade lacks one thing that Bobae didn't really discuss, which is early game power. Yes, it's something that you can play and slam, but it's not something that actually gets better until you scale your composition. Remember, Gunblade gets better the stronger your carries are. And early game, unless you're hitting specifically like a headliner that can really capitalize on it, which is not every game, very rare in fact, you're not going to have many good holders of it because you're just going to have 1-star backline, or maybe like, or you have like a 2-star headliner and you have like a 1-star frontline. It's rare to have like the good mix where Gunblade's like really good early game. And so if you're trading off that early game power and you're slamming those items, then it's not really as consistent as you would hope it to be. Not to mention that I think that while Hextech Gunblade is a little bit better on champions than people think it is, I don't think think it's as versatile as he's selling it to be. So I'm voting for Dishsoap. This is partially because Bobae tries to play around Ahri a lot more than Dishsoap I think does, because Dishsoap probably doesn't think Ahri is reliable enough for him to hit, which I think I agree with. Hand of Justice being S tier for Bobae versus B tier. I think the explanation is actually similar to here, except it's not that Dishsoap thinks that it's like too weak, but Dishsoap wants Biss, like just straight up Biss. Here, I think I'm gonna go ahead and vote Dishsoap again. I think that while Hodge is very flexible, I do think that it's not as effective in the early mid game unless you're getting certain augments like Idealism, or you're getting like champions that can really benefit off of them that are like kind of like melee or 2 hex range champions, or champions that really benefit off of crit. So it's flexible for sure. And also it's a really good item that makes you like open a reroll if you want to go for like Yone and Riven and things like that. Not to mention that like you kind of want that as a healing source that also amplifies off of crit. It's just that I think that Dishsoap has it summarized correctly, which is it's like a leftover item after you can go for some of these other really strong items. I mean, there's like a bunch of items that you can do with Glove and Tears, and they are two of the most premium components you can start off with right now. So I think I lean more towards Dishsoap here being in like a B tier. Although I think my feelings was that it's like kind of on the bottom of A tier. Ginsu's Rage Blade at A versus Dishsoap putting it at D. This is a huge contrast once again. There's a lot of things I can say about Rage Blade. I think it's a cool item. I think it's a fun item. I don't think it's a very strong item, but I do understand that Bobae thinks that Sona is just insane with this item. You know, some AP carries like Specific and Ahri, but I do think Rage Blade is quite a poor item. I've been in situations late game where I feel like my carries don't deal a lot of damage at all. But on the other hand, I also don't think it's like completely awful to make it. There are other situations that you can actually slam this item that make me think that Rage Blade is more playable. Like for example, if you're playing like Rage Blade with a Gambler's Blade and you start off with like an artifact anvil and you're able to scale that. Not to mention that sometimes you start off with like Heartsteel and then Rage Blade Aphelios can be really good to get you to fast 9, and that's the way you can get to Sona more often. And one player from Vietnam, YBY, has hit rank 1 globally like 2000 LP doing a strategy like this. For Dishsoap to put it like towards the bottom of D tier as the second worst item in the game, I think is a little bit exaggerative. So I'm gonna go ahead and vote for Bobae. I think that it's a lot closer to like bottom of B tier and like maybe top of C tier than it is at the very bottom, like one of the worst items in the game. Explanation: Sona with Rage Blade is a win con and be strong early. Jewel Gauntlet at A versus D. I just think Jewel Gauntlet in general is like understated, and if you're telling me that Jewel Gauntlet is not bad because like Karthus can use it, one of the weakest carries in the game, I'm not really convinced. This one's an easy disto for me. Bobae open to AP comps and carries like Karthus. I will say Jewel Gauntlet is kind of underrated on units like Vex, because Vex is an executioner as well. That's AP scaling. But I'm not going out of my way to slam Jewel Gauntlet. But I guess, you know, rods are bad. All right, that's a good summary of it. Open AP carries like Karthus and rods are bad. Nasher's Tooth, A versus C. I think Nasher's, because Bobae's explanation, it actually makes a lot of sense that he's willing to play around things like Shojin and Nasher's, and that Nasher's is also a more flexible item, and you can also tuck into the AD line. And so if I'm voting for Bobae on the S tier of Shojin, I can understand like why puts Nasher's in A, and I think for that very same reason, I think I have to favor Bobae in this situation and go along with him. Guardbreaker being D from Bobae is really interesting. It's probably my sharpest disagreement with him, period. I think that while Belt and Glove are great components, it's not like Guardbreaker doesn't do anything. And it's fascinating that he even talks about like executioners and crits and how he wants to get like certain damage. And I feel like there's a lot of shielding units in the game. A lot of people are playing things like Echo and Set, and there's like a lot of ways you can get Guardbreaker value. It's not like something I'm going out of my way to slam. I think Dishsoap nailed it by just putting in the B tier, so I'm just going to go ahead and put it in there. Belt and Gloves are important items, with Dishsoap values flexibility, which is actually really interesting. If Bobae wants to have a lot of flexibility, isn't Guardbreaker kind of like an open flex item? All right, so far, Dishsoap has an early lead after the biggest disagreements. As for minor disagreements, I think we can do this pretty quickly. Ragdoll C versus B, and it's because Dishsoap is willing to slam it, and Bobae doesn't really like it very much. E-Claw doesn't really stop AP, but sometimes need defense. I think I value Dishsoap here. Yeah, you're not really trying to stop AP and Ahri with the Dragon's Claw, but hey, I mean, you just need frontline items. I think people don't slam enough frontline items in general, so I really feel like it's actually worth going for it sometimes, especially because Cloak's not a particularly really good item outside of Even Shroud. Stairs Gaze C versus B. This one is actually the most minor of all of them. I'm actually of the belief that maybe I shouldn't even bother doing this one, but we're gonna go ahead and add this anyways for the tally of of votes. Bobae doesn't like melee AD, but Dishsoap is open to it. Once again, I think Dishsoap here takes the crown because I think the AD items that he's valuing make sense. And also I think that he's able to see a lot more lines with things like playing like Zed and Akali more than other people. Adaptive Helm being C versus B. Bobae's explanation of Adaptive Helm being components that you actually really want to hold on to, like tier is just like too valuable, and also it's not particularly that strong of a tank item, and it's okay as a mana item / AP item in the backline situations. It's like more you're happy to take this if you either have the fully adapted augments or late game situation, and just like I'll just slam it if I have it. It's like fine. And so this one's like a really minor one, but tier is too valuable and there are better items. I think because of this explanation, I think I actually agree with Bobae here. I actually think Adaptive Helm is not particularly very good, and if it was good, then fully adapted would actually be a much better augment in general, but it's not for a reason. Range Resolve, C versus D, just so considered a bait item. Bobae considers it a situational item. I mean, I think it's just correct that it's situational. Like it's clear that Titans is not like the worst item. It's not a complete bait item. It's just that you're not really happy to go out of your way and build it, but in some builds that want it, they like really want it. So to put it as like a bait item, I think is a little extreme. I'm gonna vote Bobae here. Just thinks TR is bad outside of Yone, but I'm gonna favor Bobae here. Last but not least, Morel Namicon, D versus C. Bobae thinks it is the worst item in the game, and Dishsoap thinks that it is situational. And I mean, for the very same reason of Titans Resolve being bait for Dishsoap and Morel Namicon being bait for Bobae, I'm gonna favor Dishsoap here. I think Morello, sometimes you just gotta build it, man. You don't have a better choice, and you're trying to kill rods. You talk about how rod's a bad item. Sometimes you need it for anti-heal, and while you don't have like the best holders of it, like Echo is still fine and scales off the stats pretty well. So I think that Morello is still situationally pretty good, and I think Dishsoap nailed it. Very few good Morello holders, and Rod sucks. All right, so with this in mind, I'm gonna go ahead and tally the votes here. Dishsoap 4-3 on the big disagreements. Dishsoap 3-2 on the minor disagreements. So I suppose you guys heard it here first. Frodan's verdict: Dishsoap is who I'm gonna be favoring for this patch. Although I think you could say that I'm probably North American biased and English speaking biased, and that could possibly be true. At the same time, I do think that there's a lot of merit to what both players are saying, and I feel like I'm being pretty fair. If anything, it's funny enough, I actually think I play more like Bobae than I play like Dishsoap in terms of how I approach this patch. I'm willing to play AP lines. I think Disco is underrated, for example. But overall, I think the explanations and the tier listing, just off the way that Dishsoap structured his arguments, I think I just give him the slight edge. But both these players are fantastic players in their own right, and I really enjoy watching both their content. And I think both these players are like world champ material. They're both incredibly strong and solid, consistent set over set, and I look forward to seeing them compete, hopefully against each other very soon. So there you have it, my comparison of the top tier list by the top players for this patch. It's been a really long patch, so it's really interesting to see how the meta evolves. And funny enough, I'm pretty sure that these players might even go back to their videos even a week after they make it and probably disagree with themselves. Dishsoap even made a tweet saying that he's changing the way he's approaching almost day to day of how he plays the patch. So there's a lot to uncover, and that's what makes TFT a truly special game. Before you go, I'm starting a new YouTube video of my highlight games where I get to do a bunch of tubers and off-meta plays and maybe some just general ridiculous TFT zaniness. Definitely check it out and subscribe. The first few views and subs and engagements and likes. Much love to anybody that supports the channel. I love you all. Have a great start of 2024, and I'll see you guys next time.